Welcome to Climate Plus, a Devex podcast. I'm Michael Igo, senior reporter at Devex. Every year, usually around this time, the world turns its attention to climate change and what we're doing, or not doing, about it. At the UN Climate Conference, or COP, negotiators get deep into the weeds on every aspect of the climate crisis. This year, it's happening in Dubai. To help make sense of this complex, critical moment, we're bringing you conversations with leading climate thinkers, activists, and experts, and asking them, can COP28 deliver?
If we ask the question, are institutions fit for purpose? I would say yes and no. I would say that the devil is in the detail. So it's not that money is not available, it's what type of money and at what cost.
The climate story is, in many ways, a story about transformation of energy systems, of the global economy, of our lives, and of the very institutions that are responsible for delivering the financial and technical resources to make all of that happen. Institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, regional development banks, and multilateral organizations that set the rules for international cooperation. To deliver climate action on the scale that the crisis demands, these institutions will have to transform the way they work. And it's hard to transform if you don't have a plan. Enter the Bridgetown Initiative, an ambitious set of proposals to overhaul the development finance architecture for an era of climate emergency. It's been spearheaded by Barbados Prime Minister Mottley, who has emerged as one of the most forceful voices for doing more to support climate-vulnerable countries like her own. But it's hardly a one-woman show. Pepukaye Bardouille, herself a Caribbean climate champion from Dominica, directs the Bridgetown Initiative unit of the Barbados government. She spoke with Devex editor-in-chief Kumar about what it will take to reimagine development finance institutions as critical pieces of the climate change puzzle. Here's their conversation.
Hey, Pep, great to get to talk with you. The Bridgetown Initiative, everybody is very clued in to what you all are doing in little Barbados. I know you're in DC today, but wow, has Prime Minister Mottley put Barbados on the map in a big way. I actually told her that last week when we were on stage together at the Paris Peace Forum, and she said, well, don't forget about Rihanna. Barbados has multiple major exports, but especially as we think of COP28, what the Prime Minister is doing, what you're doing at the Bridgetown Initiative is just so front and center to the big global debate around how we go forward in this climate emergency. So I'm just so thrilled to get a few minutes to talk with you today.
No, it's great to be here, Raj. And I will say that small countries do have a habit of punching above their weight, so don't underestimate.
Definitely not. And we will certainly talk today about small island developing states and kind of where they fit in. Maybe we could just kind of level set for people. What is the Bridgetown agenda? What's it all about?
Look, Bridgetown emerged, I would say, before the end of the COVID crisis as a rallying call, a rallying cry for attention to be paid to a number of issues that many countries had been facing, debt sustainability, liquidity, and of course the climate crisis, which compounds what people had been going through, many countries had been going through for the better part of 2.5 years. We're all just emerging from COVID. I think at its inception, Bridgetown sought to shine a light on issues that maybe had not really been at the forefront for some time. So for countries, particularly those that have a high dependency on tourism, for instance, COVID was devastating. Government revenues declined, jobs disappeared. And on top of that, you had mounting healthcare costs. You had mounting unemployment costs to contend with. And so liquidity was a very, very serious challenge, particularly in small island developing states, but frankly, in countries dependent on tourism and those not, those for whom workers had to stay home for months at a time, and the economy was simply struggling. When you think about debt on top of that, debt for many countries, relates to big projects, but for others, it's very simply about, finding enough resources to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, health, education, roads, electricity, digital connection. All of that requires a significant investment, both in human resources, but also in capital structures, in buildings, in infrastructure. Most countries in the developing world, in the global south, have not had the wherewithal, to keep up with multiple developments in technology and in connectivity, but also to meet basic needs of their populations. And when we add on to that climate change, the climate hazards and the impacts of those hazards that have been faced by, again, primarily low-lying coastal and small island developing states, the issues over the past decade have only been mounting. I serve the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, but I'm from the island of Dominica, which faced a series of storms, most recently Hurricane Maria, which was a Category 5 storm that pummeled the island in 2017. And the impact was over 200% of GDP overnight, loss and damage to the country. And so, keeping up with the day-to-day of your development challenges, on top of that, addressing climate change, which can take you back decades, really needed to be highlighted. And I really think that's what Bridgetown was about when it was first conceived. It's gotten more specific over the past year or so, year and a half that it's been in existence, and I'd be happy to delve into a little bit more detail. But I think really understanding the genesis is important for your listeners.
Yeah, I agree. And I think so much is kind of the context, right? And I think about, you talked about COVID, I think about how indebted countries are, especially low and middle income countries. And it feels like there's no way out. We've already seen some defaults. There are many other countries that are on the edge, on the precipice. And at the very same time, we're all calling for a big energy transition, and we want to address poverty. So it seems like the context is so key to why Bridgetown kind of was born. But I guess I wonder, implicit in all of this is a pretty strong critique of the existing international system, right? Because we have a World Bank, we have regional development banks, we have bilateral agencies. I mean, we have a lot of architecture that you would think is designed exactly to address these problems. But I think implicit in the idea that the Prime Minister and the whole team of people, including yourself, have gotten behind this agenda is to say, no, what we have isn't fit for purpose. I mean, how do you see that, the implication for the international system?
Look, that's an excellent question. I think you're absolutely right. A very central piece of the Bridgetown agenda is about the reform of the global climate and development financing architecture. And of course, that architecture is not just, what it is that is provided, but how and to whom and under what conditions. Yes, you talked about countries being indebted, but again, the context has been set. Why are countries indebted? Prime Minister speaks often and very, very vocally about the fact that governments in many countries in the West are able to borrow at a certain interest rate and certain tenors. And yet governments in poorer countries often have a disproportionately high cost of capital, which affects their ability to afford more. So you're in debt because you have, needs that have been piling up for decades. You have populations that are growing. You have, the challenges of the triple crisis that we've been facing, interest rates going up, COVID and climate change. And then as you look to the future, if you don't debottleneck that, it simply amplifies. It gets worse and worse. So if we ask the question, are institutions fit for purpose? I would say yes and no. I would say that the devil is in the detail. So it's not that money is not available. It's what type of money and at what cost. And when I say what type of money, there is concessional lending, and then there's more concessional lending, and then there's grant money, and then there's commercial capital, right? And that's a spectrum. You have free money, which everyone would take if it were offered to them, and you have very expensive money, which many countries, frankly, don't have any other option but to take. And somewhere in between, there are different types of money. I think that's really what we're saying is that we need to take a much more nuanced approach when we're investing in climate resilience. And remember, we're talking for countries, speaking for those countries that for the most part have had very little to do with climate change. Again, take Dominica, a country of about 65,000 people, that has had very little to do with global warming and yet suffered, storm after storm. And frankly, the prospects are not great for the future. So when we think about these countries that are building resilient infrastructure, they're trying to underground their power lines. They're trying to deal with water losses from infrastructure that was built during the colonial era. And that, for climate adaptation, we need to deal with mounting droughts, risk of droughts and changing rainfall patterns. That's all incredibly expensive, right? How do we finance that? If we're financing that at effectively commercial terms, it's unaffordable. Billions and billions of dollars of capital are required. And so there are projects where, you could say, look, these are frankly commercially viable. If you look at solar energy, if you look at wind, technology costs have come down to a level where in most countries, if you have a decent economy of scale, they're incredibly cost competitive. In smaller countries, maybe not as cost competitive, but we can look at viability gap financing. If you look at projects like, retrofitting homes with hurricane straps or rebuilding roofs in very vulnerable slum areas so that those populations are protected during a weather event, undergrounding cables, there isn't really a immediate financial return on investment. There may be an economic return. It may be beneficial to the country, but if you don't really have a revenue stream that can cover the cost of capital, you have to pay for it out of your government coffers. And there's only so far and so deep those coffers can go. So I think the international financing architecture has to really recognize that, one, there are investments that are commercially viable. Two, there are investments that are not commercially viable, but have a huge economic benefit. And particularly when we talk about disaster risk reduction, I think it's been pretty widely recognized that, for every dollar invested in disaster prevention, you save $1 in resources that would be required for recovery. And yet we're required, effectively to borrow money to recover rather than be allocated funding at much lower cost to prevent the disasters when it would not only serve the countries well, but also serve our financing partners.
Is there a trade-off here that low-income countries are right to be worried about? Because there's been some discussion that some of the poorest countries in the world say, well, this whole agenda might end up shifting funding to middle-income countries to do the kinds of projects that there's a lot of private sector interest in, like solar farms. And so you end up with countries, small ones like Barbados, but that are middle income, or large ones like Indonesia, and you say, well, what about the very poorest countries that are really not emitting a lot, that don't have any real fiscal space and don't have the capability to raise money in the international markets? And now, is there going to be a lot less concessional capital for them? I'm sure you've heard this thread, at least, of argumentation. What do you say about it? How do you feel about that?
I have heard it many times, and for that, I think it's about time that I got a T-shirt. I had this discussion actually with some colleagues at the World Bank, and that T-shirt would read, "We need more, we need cheaper, and we need longer term." So it's not just about, reallocating the resources that are currently available. It's about growing the pie. And there is simply no way around that. The reality is that the financing that has been committed to address the crises that we're facing globally is simply not enough. We need to mobilize private capital. And we need to crowd that in. And there's very many ways of doing that, right? There are guarantees that can be placed. There is, early stage project development support that can be used to crowd in capital. There's de-risking instruments. That's all well known. So that's one way you can grow the pie. But unfortunately, there isn't much of a way around saying that we're simply going to need to find creative ways of getting the development finance institutions to lend more. So this is not about, creating some sort of chasm between, lower income and, middle to high income countries, from small island states versus, countries at risk of desertification, from countries in Africa versus countries in the Pacific. No, let's not get into that conversation. The reality is that we simply need more.
Climate Plus is supported by the World Bank. Back in October, World Bank President Ajay Banga called for a new vision for ending poverty on a livable planet, with a focus on climate action.
We cannot endure another period of emission-heavy growth. We must find a way to finance a different world where our climate is protected, where pandemics are manageable, if not preventable, where food is abundant and fragility and poverty are defeated. We do not suffer from a shortage of solutions. We're just paralyzed by a persistent lack of courage to pursue them. The good news is that we have solutions like these within reach and resources at our disposal to scale them.
To learn more about efforts to end poverty on a livable planet, search for the World Bank Group at COP28 or click the link in the show notes.
And so what about the places where at least it seems like we're making progress on this agenda? And I'm thinking in particular about the World Bank has a new leader. It has this evolution roadmap. A lot of the changes that are envisioned at the bank are exactly the kinds of things you're talking about at the Bridgetown Initiative. Do you feel like when you look at that reform agenda, it is aligned? Is it moving at the pace it needs to move at? What would you say about reform at the World Bank and the other MDBs?
Look, I think that's an excellent question. And I look at this as an opportunity to strengthen and deepen and broaden partnerships. The World Bank has really responded quickly. They've come up with the evolution roadmap within a very short space of time. The Prime Minister spoke about the need for change and the World Bank responded. I think it's coming up on about a year since the evolution roadmap first came out. So I think that not only is the intention there, but the action is coming along. But the devil is in the detail. And the reality is that we have many, many details to work out. I think, I don't really want to speak for the Prime Minister, but I think that many people were very happy to see that the World Bank's President Ajay Banga came out at the Paris summit in June and spoke about the bank backing natural disaster clauses, which is exceptional. I think, again, the question then is for which countries, under which conditions. Is it retroactive? Is it principal and interest? Is it forward-looking or historical and forward-looking loans? And is there a cost associated for subscribing to the natural disaster clause option? And if there is a cost, which is simply to cover transactions that the bank needs to pay for, so the bank isn't making money on that, fully understandable. But are there ways to get the donors to cover those costs so it doesn't become yet another impediment to government signing up? So I think the intention is there, the action is there, but we really need to make sure that we're getting into the details of the things that really do, create frustration, in the bank's clients about it doing enough. Because I really do think that we both, within the Bridgetown Initiative team and the MDB space are really trying to do the right thing. It's about making sure that we converge at the right point so that it's not platitudes. It's not staying at the one line, Financial Times headline level. It's really about how does this instrument benefit the clients that we're trying to serve, and how do we provide sufficient feedback so that the World Bank and other MDBs are doing what they need to do and what they actually do ultimately want to do in the end.
You're so right to talk about the details really matter, the execution, the tools, and you know this well because you've worked at the World Bank. You were inside the IFC. You've seen how this institution works from the inside. One of the things I hear a lot of people talk about is that we need a cultural shift at the World Bank and institutions like it. Would you agree with that? Is this because part of this obviously is, having the right tools and the right mechanisms, the right business model, but how much of it is the people who actually work at the World Bank? Are they kind of ready for it? Do they have the mindset shift that you've got? Do you see that as a challenge, or do you think they're coming along? What's your take on it as someone who knows the institution?
Oh, you're throwing the easy questions at me today. Look, I do come from the World Bank Group. I was a young professional. I joined the bank, a couple of decades ago, almost, I think. Time is flying. And I can tell you that every single person in my cohort and pretty much every single person I've ever worked with, be it at IFC, the World Bank, or at MIGA, is there for the right reasons. So if we talk about the mindset shift, it's not a mindset shift in terms of, am I here for impact? I think it's more an institutional shift. And you see this in the MTBs as much as you see it in governments, as much as you see it in the private sector. The reality is that whenever you have a large number of people that are working towards even a single direction, you're going to put into place procedures, policies, mechanisms tools, systems that are intended to help them get there. Sometimes those well-intentioned structures can get in the way. You do have a good reason to have them there, right? It's about due diligence. It's about making sure you have the right approvals, you have the right level of oversight, you're doing well with the money that has been vested in you. But sometimes, things get a little bit complex. So I wouldn't say that it's about culture at an individual level. I would say that it is about the structures that have been created that may have, in some instances, they may have, the desired impact. And in other instances, they may simply slow things down. I'll give you a concrete example, and this is not specific to the bank. So I definitely don't want to get, told that this doesn't work in the bank. But if you look at development more broadly, I spent many years in the energy access space, looking at, deep rural areas, urban informal settlements, and what it would take to make those populations, accessible to the power grid, be it off grid or grid connected, or centrally connected. And if you think about a grid extension project, you are stringing power lines. If you want to make them resilient, ideally you would put them underground, depending on the distance from the load center to the power plant or the transmission system. But if those populations also need water, if they also need road upgrades, you would ideally do all of that at the same time. If you have a structure which separates the water team from the power team from the roads team, and you're not necessarily incentivized to book a loan of $500 million, for example, to do all three things at once, because that would end up being a third by sector, but you are incentivized to book $500 million for a single sector, then you're not necessarily going to look at the solution from the point of view or the perspective of the end user. I need water, I need power, I need roads. You're potentially going to look at it from the point of view of the supply side, which is I need to book a $500 million deal, so let's do the roads or the power lines or the water infrastructure. So I think this is generally an issue of, are we incentivized as an institution to understand fully what the challenges are that our clients are facing, and to separate those challenges from what it is that we as individuals or a department or vice presidency is incentivized to do, because we have targets. And that, I think, can be resolved. You can find ways around that. You can encourage not just cross-departmental collaboration, but you can encourage, I would say, targets to be set that are not specific to a sector. When you get too sector specific, I think you find that people don't collaborate as much as they would if they were trying to solve the problem, again, from the point of view of the person, living 200 kilometers from the nearest town center.
I think you put that so beautifully, because I've heard lots of people talk about this, but your example really brings to light, it doesn't matter if you have a PhD in economics, if you're brilliant and you've worked on many projects on many continents. At the end of the day, we're all people, and we respond to incentives, including the kind of institutional incentives that exist inside really big bureaucracies like the World Bank Group. And it's such a great point. And I think you're focusing here on sectors in your example, but I think it also cuts across the tools within the World Bank Group, right? Thinking about MEGA and the importance of using guarantees, especially as we want to bring in more private sector funding, or thinking of the IFC and wanting to integrate a private sector-led approach to a lot of the kinds of initiatives we're talking about. And right now, a lot of these things kind of live independently and separately. And so I think your point is great. I think about how Ajay Banga has said, look, we're going to go from a corporate scorecard with 153 indicators, I think, down to 20. And it kind of gets to your point of we got to find the cross-cutting themes here and get out of the practice of just thinking in all these little silos, because at the end of the day, that community you're connecting to the grid, if you really want that community to develop, you have to think of it in a holistic way and to give them all the tools that they need.
Absolutely. And if I could just jump in quickly, Raj, you talk about the institution having, a pretty excellent toolkit. I fully agree. I think we have, I would say, within the bank group, probably 90% of what's necessary, but the remaining 10%, which I think is a combination of instruments as well as risk tolerance, I think could definitely be improved on. But I would say ultimately, it's really about deliberately going out there and looking for opportunities to create synergy and create these virtuous circles, as opposed to doing it by accident or by chance or just based on relationships. And there are excellent relationships between colleagues at the bank and IFC, but that doesn't necessarily, create the volume that you want. And as we think about, again, bringing it back to Bridgetown, what is needed. We need to do things differently. We need to do things in small places where it's hard to find that $100, $200, $300, $400 million loan. So we're going to have to get a lot more comfortable. That means we have to start aggregating. That means we have to become much more efficient. We need these institutions to be able to collaborate with domestic capital markets. And that's not going to happen without, I would say, a lot of push. And risk tolerance is critical as well. Again, from my perspective, having spent time within the institutions, my sense is that just the way the institutions are structured, you are incentivized, again, to do larger transactions. You're incentivized to do transactions where the return is fairly certain and risk is fairly low. But who sets those parameters? That's not, people don't wake up one day and say, I don't want to take risk. That becomes, either comes down from the board or has become a part of the culture of the institution. And sometimes you don't even know why you're risk averse. So I think challenging, not just do we need more instruments, do we need to set the scorecard in such a way, but also are we taking the right amount of risk? And I will say that if the institutions that we on the Bridgetown Initiative side see as a critical counterparts are not taking risk, then it's going to be a long, hard slog to get to where we need to go. And frankly, we don't have time.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Advas Aldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of Devex Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
The way I like to think about it is that the bank has to go from being a lending institution that measures success in like, how many loans have we done or how big are the loans, to more of a deal-making institution that's thinking about an entire geography or an entire industry and saying, how do we put together all the pieces to help a country or a region, let's say, develop an electric car industry? How do we think in those terms, which is going to require lots of private sector, much more private sector than official, finance, but it's also going to require someone to coordinate this and orchestrate, which leads me to, another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And because those in some ways, they're emblematic of what you just described for the MDBs, which is, they are bringing together all the tools and trying to help countries that, are really looking at a long runway of reliance on coal power to be able to make a transition more quickly. But it has not been easy, to say the least. I mean, there's progress in the sense that there's more and more of the JETPs coming. A number of countries are signed up, but boy, it's been tough. And I guess I wonder, how do you see the JETPs are going, and why do you think it's been so tough?
Yeah, I think that there is some room for improvement on the JETPs, right? Why has it been tough? I think it depends on the country that you're looking at, and I certainly don't want to single any country out. But I feel quite strongly that, governments have, again, the desire to provide for their populations, but it's often a real juggle and sometimes a real struggle, particularly if you're looking at the short term. When we take a marathon perspective, I think it's very easy to say, listen, we're all on the right track. The question is, can we demonstrate those results over a year or 2 years or 3 years? And the reality is that, the governments are under pressure to do things faster, and in many cases have multiple interests that they're struggling with. I was going to jump in on something that you said earlier, right, which was about crowding in the private sector. The reality is that, development partners need, and I think it's got to become not just a reality, but a realization, need to come along to support investment plans that are country-led and are holistic. If you take the JETPs, I think, that deals with climate change mitigation, that deals with the emission side. But the reality is that governments are trying to balance, mitigation and adaptation together, not always straightforward, firstly. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, short-term and long-term, also not always easy to reconcile. But I think the true country ownership may be taken for granted, right? I feel that often we say that, we want countries to own things, but the reality is that the driving is actually being done from the outside. One of the things that I've been working on in parallel to supporting on the Bridgetown Initiative is developing a prosperity and resilience investment plan for Barbados, which lays out everything that the government is seeking to achieve over the next 10 or so years. And let's see if we're able to complete it, in the next few weeks. But the reality is that is a truly country-led, not just country-owned, because I think there's a bit of a label, is this country-owned? It's a country-driven process. No one asked Barbados to do that, right? I think that if we take, the jet Ps, take a little bit of a step back from your question, if we take the jet Ps in the context of what it is that governments are having to contend with, we might find that the challenge lies in how well anchored they are in what the country is truly desirous of achieving.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, because on the one hand, these are countries that are heavily reliant on coal production for their electricity, but they don't have enough electricity for their people as it is.
Absolutely.
So, right. So it's a tough sell to say, turn off those coal plants or at least wind them down. We'll be there to help you with renewable energy. I mean, it sounds nice, but you can imagine how political leaders find this to be a real struggle. And especially when you think of all the workers involved in the coal industry, right? And the domestic business interests. And, this is a tall order. So, it's ambitious, and you don't expect something this ambitious to just go swimmingly from day one. But it's also a little bit discouraging that it hasn't moved faster, given how critical this is. I think it's still a third of the world's electricity comes from coal. And there's just, there's no way we hit the targets if we keep burning all this coal.
That's I don't think there's any way around that, right? We need to transition, but how we transition and the extent to which that transition is anchored in a holistic approach for the country, and again, not just for a sector. This is not just about the energy sector. I know that we're looking at just transition, but switching jobs from one sector to the other takes time. You need to be able to create in parallel entire industries. You need to look at where population centers are currently. And I think, again, that just takes me back to it's a long race, right? So when we say that they haven't been successful, I would say successful, in what context? Potentially at the short term, no, they're not delivering quick results. At the long term, if they're anchored within a journey that governments need to make sure that they are delivering on, maybe, the first steps are the hardest and progress comes after that. But I do think that the real issue is, again, the bifurcation, energy, water, roads. Similarly, we're looking at emissions versus emissions in a country that has tens, hundreds of millions of people to feed. It has jobs that need to be created. It has sectors that need to be repurposed. That does not happen overnight. Does that mean that it shouldn't happen? Absolutely not. Does that mean I'm not for energy transitions? I'm absolutely for them. But I think we need to be a lot more thoughtful about how complex it is from the government's perspective. And it's in that context that development partners need to crowd in. And as you mentioned earlier, look for the solution, broker the deal, as opposed to look for the transaction, that will tick a single box.
I love the nuance you're bringing to this conversation. So I've got to ask you about loss and damage too, because I also, similar to Jet P, I kind of wonder about this. In a way, it makes perfect sense that the countries that were not responsible for climate change should get some kind of compensation and be able to manage the losses and the damage they're suffering as a result of the emissions of rich countries. But on the other hand, this is an era in which we're trying to raise precious resources and we're falling way short of what's needed. Is loss and damage potentially kind of a distraction from what you're trying to do with the Bridgetown Initiative? Like taking political energy away from the solutions focus that you've got?
No, absolutely not. Loss and damage is one of the pieces in Bridgetown. So, it's not an either or. I think, again, I tend to look at life on a spectrum. If we think about, all the stuff that has to be done to ensure that we're bringing emissions down, no way around it. It has to happen. If we're thinking about disaster risk reduction and everything I mentioned earlier, every dollar invested saves $4 on the back end. Do we not make those investments? No, we have to make those investments while we're also reducing emissions. Does that mean that we cannot have a loss and damage fund? Absolutely need to have a loss and damage fund, because the reality is that emissions are not coming down fast enough. There's not enough money being poured in to disaster risk reduction, prevention, and resilience building. As a result, we will have losses. We will have damages, and those are only going to get bigger. Look at Pakistan. 30 million people affected by that flood. That's crazy. Will there ever be enough commitment to the size, the volume, and nature of resources required to address 30 million people affected in a single country, let alone the hundreds of millions of people, that are already being affected in both acute as well as kind of slow onset chronic ways? No. And so I would say, unequivocally, loss and damage is a key piece of the Bridgetown agenda, because again, we're not looking at this as an either or.
So we're just, days away from Dubai. What are you kind of looking to as you look ahead to this COP? Like, how do you think this COP will be remembered? What are the things you're sort of pushing to see happen at this COP in particular, just coming up?
Yeah, from my side, I think this is a COP where we can really talk about what it will take to catalyze private capital. That's a key piece that I'm personally looking forward to seeing move. It doesn't come at the cost or the expense of anything else, but I think that this is a really important one, in part perhaps because of where the COP presidency comes from, and also where it's being held. I think there's an opportunity to put a slightly different spin on it, but I don't think that we should be looking at private capital, catalytic capital mobilization as being the be all and end all. I think this takes us back to the beginning of the conversation, which is that governments need to meet very basic needs. I don't feel that we should be, pitting climate challenges against basic human dignity, for lack of a better word, right? Human dignity and progress preconditions, which are encapsulated in the SDGs. And so, as much as we can push for the private capital mobilization and commitments around that, both from governments in terms of what it is that they need, what their investment plans are going to look like, and what type of sort of catalytic tools they require, and the private sector. Let's not forget, there are many, many opportunities to bring the private sector, and there's a lot of money that's looking for a home. I think it's about making sure that there's a meeting in the middle. But I don't think that should be, I don't think we should be patting ourselves on the back if we're able to achieve progress on private capital, because that means that we've left, the really key bits related to the development agenda off the hook. I think that needs to be done in parallel and with a mounting call for, what I mentioned earlier. We need more, we need cheaper, and we need longer term capital to make any of this equation balance. So personally, I think, seeing some real commitments on private financing, but seeing way more commitment to concessional financing, which is absolutely critical for laying the foundation for resilience.
So maybe just as we wrap up here, take us kind of behind the scenes of your life, if you would. I remember when the Bridgetown meeting was being organized and hearing from friends saying, yeah, I'm going to Barbados for this meeting, and thinking, interesting, like, I wonder what is going to come of this. And boy, a lot has come of it. I mean, you have been on a wild ride for, the last year and a half or something. I guess I'd love to understand a little bit more from this enormous policy advocacy success story that I think is the Bridgetown Initiative, right? The idea that the prime minister of a country of 280,000 people is helping to lead a global agenda on climate and development. It's sort of an unlikely story, and it seems to be happening. So, take us a little bit behind the scenes of what it's been like for you. What is kind of a day in the life of Pep? What do you do? What are the conversations you're having, and how do you actually make all of this activity drive towards some real action?
Wow. Great question. I am one of the newbies to the team. I joined in June this year, so I've been around for coming up on 6 months. Clearly, Prime Minister Mottley and other key people in the team, Avinash Prasad and many others within government have have been the ones on the wild ride, right? They're traveling incessantly, meeting with, everyone from, heads of the MDBs to, sovereigns to, CEOs of companies. But there's a huge push also from civil society. There's been a tremendous, I would say support, but more of movement building that's come from the outside. So I think, whatever the ride has been, it hasn't been a lonely one. I think people have been piling on, which is fantastic. A day in my life, well, I have two small kids, so I juggle them. I'm trying to travel as little as possible and at the same time, do the most one can at an opportunity, a moment in time where we have just incredible, I would say, drive both internally and externally, as well as an imperative to get this right. It's not just Bridgetown, there's leadership from the African continent, as we saw with the Africa Climate Summit. I think with Brazil taking on the G20 in the next couple of months. Again, there's this global south, tremendous coalition building, which is emphasized and I would say reinforced by many partners from the global north, right? So a day in my life looks like, trying to reach out to people in many parts of the world, strengthening coalitions with Africa, strengthening coalitions, within the global south more broadly, but also extending a hand, to the MDBs. I've said, many times during this conversation that I come from the World Bank Group. I'm actually on secondment to Prime Minister Mottley's office to support her for 2 years. But that also provides an opportunity to reach out and kind of kick things across the line. So, we talked about those headlines of what Bridgetown is trying to achieve and all the details of things that need to be unpacked and solidified under that. A lot of my day involves reaching out, to colleagues within the World Bank Group to figure out, how do we make this real? To reaching out to folks in the private sector, how do we make this real? And that's where I spend most of my time. I'm also spending a good amount of time, at least half at the moment, on working on Barbados' investment plan, which has been a tremendous opportunity to get to know colleagues from across government, every single sector, understand not just the challenges they're facing, but their vision for the next 10 years and trying to put some numbers to that. And that ties very neatly into Bridgetown. Where do we need concessional money? Where do we need grant money? Where is there a commercial opportunity, even in a country as small as Barbados? And there are many other smaller countries that have tremendous potential. So I would say it's a combination of the forest and the trees, the forest being Bridgetown, the trees being the details of Barbados. Again, the forest, which is the headlines of the Bridgetown Initiative, the trees being kicking things across the finish line. And that's pretty much it.
Well, this has got to be one of the most important and fascinating stories in the world, and you're right at the center of it. So it has been such a pleasure to get to talk to you, Pepukaye Bardouille, who is the director of the Bridgetown Initiative unit of the Barbados government. I will see you in Dubai.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm a small speck in a large ocean, but we're really excited to be doing what we're doing, and thank you so much for the space to share this.
Thanks for listening to Climate Plus. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, and you can also leave us a rating or a review. We'll be publishing episodes twice a week in the lead up to, during, and after COP28, so make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast streaming platform. If you want to share some feedback on this episode or have questions you'd like answered, we'd love to hear from you. Drop me a message on X, formerly Twitter, @alterigo, or send an email to podcast@devex.com. Climate Plus is a podcast from Devex. Raj Kumar was the interviewer for today's episode. It was produced and edited by Naomi Mihara. The series editor is Catherine Cheney. It's hosted by me, Michael Igo.